Medical disclaimer. The content of this video is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis or treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified health provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition, and always get proper treatment for serious medical conditions. Legal disclaimer. Use only legal measures to combat the virus and cooperate with government officials, first responders and healthcare workers to make the coronavirus a thing of the past and create a perfect society ASAP. Use common sense, logic and help your fellow humans if necessary, also to lower the risk of being vaccinated mandatorily ourselves and to end the pandemic as soon as possible. The objective of my videos is not to slander people nor to incite or trigger people, but to do the opposite, exposing it when people are wrongly accused and to create universal peace, world peace or just peace on earth. People are innocent till proven guilty in the court of law. One who knows of evidence must testify, not to convict anyone without a fair trial. Greetings, spirit beings, greetings, supreme being. We are all the human race, our common enemy is death. Welcome on Perfect Society. As you can see, I've moved into a new house. I still have to unpack a lot of boxes, but I think this broadcast is too important and the next one as well. So I'm gonna live stream right now from my new location. This is the broadcast. Did Psychopath Rockefeller create the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918? Article review. So let's hop to the article that this stream is going to be about. I'm first gonna close the live dashboard and then we can see the article. It's on fort-russ.com, fortress, Russ with double S, and it's the actual title of the article. Some people argue that people that want to reduce the global population, some to 500 million, some to 100 million, have no empathy and they have an unrealistic goal in violation of people's right to physical integrity. So therefore they are psychopaths. Of course, I haven't read this yet, so we're gonna read this. I have done another broadcast about the tracking national COVID-19 testing action plan, pragmatic steps to reopen our workplaces and our communities, rockefellerfoundation.org. In this broadcast, the Rockefeller Foundation funded Mengele, now COVID-19 national testing plan, that's Eugenics wiki. So we can see that in the past the Rockefeller Foundation even funded some of the research conducted by Josef Mengele before he went to Auschwitz. And that's the Nazi_Eugenics article on Wikipedia. And I may have covered other articles, the Horrifying American Roots of Nazi Eugenics, historynewsnetwork.org. And reader-supported-news.org, a critical finding of the Nuremberg trials, Presages, worldwide disaster looming over US 2016 elections. Edwin Black's Nazi Nexus, America's corporate connections to Hitler's Holocaust, exposes and documents how, just like their German counterparts, American corporations like Ford, GM, General Motors, IBM, Coca-Cola, the Carnegie Institution and the Rockefeller Foundation surreptitiously aided and abetted the Nazis in order to gain illicit profits. I think I covered another article in this broadcast, so people can check it out. Only has 36 views. I think it's quite important when 7 billion lives are at stake. But okay, let's start with this article. Let's see if this works. Yes, then I can check some chat remark. Joe Silly with EY at Stephanie Green, great article on there today from Gary Coles about how the quote Spanish flu unquote in 1918 was most likely connected to Rockefeller anti-meningococcal bacterial vaccine killing 50 to 100 million. So thank you for attending us about this. And now I'm going to read that article. The truth about the 1918 quote viral influenza unquote pandemic unquote. So let's see if it's very long. It takes a while to select the text. Okay, let's just start reading. And then I'll interrupt it if I think there's something important. Excuse me for the bad mic quality, I still haven't set up my mic. And I plan to do that after unpacking all these boxes to have more room to move around.
Did Psychopath Rockefeller create the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918? By Dr. Gary G. Coles, MD, by guest author, last updated June 18, 2020. 011131. Share the truth about the 1918 viral influenza pandemic by Dr. Gary G. Coles, MD, May 22, 2020. It started with the Rockefeller Institute's crude bacterial meningitis vaccination experiment on U.S. troops. The 1918-19 bacterial vaccine experiment may have killed 100 million people. During the war years 1918-19, the U.S. Army ballooned to 6 million men, with 2 million men being sent overseas. The Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research took advantage of this new pool of human guinea pigs to conduct vaccine experiments. During WW1, the Rockefeller Institute also sent its experimental anti-meningococcal serum to England, France, Belgium, Italy and other countries, helping spread the epidemic worldwide. The Rockefeller Institute and its experimental bacterial meningococcal vaccine, contrary to the accepted mythology, may have killed 100 million people in 1918-1919. The crude antibacterial vaccine used in the 4-trial experiment on soldiers was made in horses. According to a 2008 National Institute of Health paper, bacterial pneumonia was the killer in a minimum of 92.7% of the 1918-19 pandemic autopsies reviewed. Clean water, sanitation, flushing toilets, refrigerated foods and healthy diets have done and still do far more to protect humanity from infectious diseases than any vaccine program. In 1918, the vaccine industry experimented on soldiers. With disastrous results, but in 2018, the vaccine industry experiments on infants every day. The vaccine schedule has never been tested as it is given. The results of the experiment are in 1 in 7 of America's fully vaccinated children is in some form of special education and over 50% have some form of chronic illness. The Spanish flu killed an estimated 100 million people during a pandemic 1918-19. What if the story we have been told about this pandemic isn't true? What if, instead, the killer infection was neither the flu nor Spanish in origin? Newly analyzed documents reveal that the Spanish flu may have been a military vaccine experiment gone awry. Summary: the reason modern technology has not been able to pinpoint the killer influenza strain from this pandemic is because influenza was not the killer. More soldiers died during WWI from disease than from bullets. The pandemic was not flu. An estimated 95%, or higher, of the deaths were caused by bacterial pneumonia, not an influenza virus. The pandemic was not Spanish. The first cases of bacterial pneumonia in 1918 trace back to military bases, the first one in Fort Riley, Kansas. From January 21 to June 4, 1918, an experimental bacterial meningitis vaccine cultured in horses by the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research in New York was injected into soldiers at Fort Riley. During the remainder of 1918, as those soldiers, often living and traveling under poor sanitary conditions, were sent to Europe to fight, they spread bacteria at every stop between Kansas and the front-line trenches in France. One study describes soldiers with active infections, who were aerosolizing the bacteria that colonized their noses and throats, while others, often, in the same breathing spaces, were profoundly susceptible to invasion of and rapid spread through their lungs by their own or others' colonizing bacteria. 1. The Spanish flu attacked healthy people in their prime. Bacterial pneumonia attacks people in their prime. Flu attacks the young, old and immunocompromised. When WW1 ended on November 11, 1918, soldiers returned to their home countries and colonial outposts, spreading the killer bacterial pneumonia worldwide. During WW1, the Rockefeller Institute also sent its experimental anti-meningococcal serum to England, France, Belgium, Italy and other countries, helping spread the epidemic worldwide. During the pandemic of 1918-19, the so-called Spanish flu killed 5,100 million people, including many soldiers. Many people do not realize that disease killed far more soldiers on all sides than machine guns or mustard gas or anything else typically associated with WWI. I have a personal connection to the Spanish flu. Among those killed by disease in 1918-19 are members of both of my parents' families. On my father's side, his grandmother Sadie Hoyt died from pneumonia in 1918. Sadie was a chief yeoman in the Navy. Her death left my grandmother Rosemary and her sister Anita to be raised by their aunt. Sadie's sister Marion also joined the Navy. She died from the influenza in 1919. On my mother's side, 2 of her father's sisters died in childhood. All of the family members who died lived in New York City. I suspect many American families, and many families worldwide, were impacted in similar ways by the mysterious Spanish flu. In 1918, influenza or flu was the catch-all term for disease of unknown origin. It didn't carry the specific meaning it does today. It meant some mystery disease which dropped out of the sky. In fact, influenza is from the medieval Latin influential in an astrological sense, meaning a visitation under the influence of the stars. Why is what happened 100 years ago important now? Between 1900 and 1920, there were enormous efforts underway in the industrialized world to build a better society. I will use New York as an example to discuss 3 major changes to society which occurred in NY during that time and their impact on mortality from infectious diseases. 1. Clean water and sanitation. In the late 19th century through the early 20th century, New York built an extraordinary system to bring clean water to the city from the Catskills, a system still in use today. New York City also built over 6,000 miles of sewer to take away and treat waste, which protects the drinking water. The World Health Organization acknowledges the importance of clean water and sanitation in combating infectious diseases. 2. Electricity. In the late 19th century through the early 20th century, New York built a power grid and wired the city so power was available in every home. Electricity allows for refrigeration. Refrigeration is an unsung hero as a public health benefit. When food is refrigerated from farm to table, the public is protected from potential infectious diseases. Cheap renewable energy is important for many reasons, including combating infectious diseases. 3. Rockefeller's pharmaceutical industry. In the late 19th century through the early 20th century, New York became the home of the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, now Rockefeller University. The institute is where the modern pharmaceutical industry was born. The institute pioneered many of the approaches the pharmaceutical industry uses today, including the preparation of vaccine serums. For better or worse, the vaccine used in the Fortriley experiment on soldiers was made in horses. U.S. mortality rates data from the turn of the 20th century to 1965 clearly indicates that clean water, flushing toilets, effective sewer systems and refrigerated foods all combined to effectively reduce mortality from infectious diseases before vaccines for those diseases became available. Have doctors and the pharmaceutical manufacturers taken credit for reducing mortality from infectious disease which rightfully belongs to sandhogs, plumbers, electricians and engineers? If hubris at the Rockefeller Institute in 1918 led to a pandemic disease which killed millions of people, what lessons can we learn and apply to 2018? The disease was not Spanish. While watching an episode of American Experience on PBS a few months ago, I was surprised to hear that the first cases of Spanish flu occurred at Fort Riley, Kansas in 1918. I thought, how is it possible this historically important event could be so badly misnamed 100 years ago and never corrected? Why Spanish? Spain was one of a few countries not involved in World War I. Most of the countries involved in the war censored their press. Free from censorship concerns, the earliest press reports of people dying from disease in large numbers came from Spain. The warring countries did not want to additionally frighten the troops, so they were content to scapegoat Spain. Soldiers on all sides would be asked to cross no man's land into machine gun fire, which was frightening enough without knowing that the trenches were a disease breeding ground. 100 years later, it's long past time to drop Spanish from all discussion of this pandemic. If the flu started at a United States military base in Kansas, then the disease could and should be more aptly named. In order to prevent future disasters, the US, and the rest of the world, must take a hard look at what really caused the pandemic. It is possible that one of the reasons the Spanish flu has never been corrected is that it helps disguise the origin of the pandemic. If the origin of the pandemic involved a vaccine experiment on US soldiers, then the US may prefer calling it Spanish flu instead of the Fort Riley bacteria of 1918, or something similar. The Spanish flu started at the location this experimental bacterial vaccine was given, making it the prime suspect as the source of the bacterial infections which killed so many. It would be much more difficult to maintain the marketing mantra of vaccines save lives if a vaccine experiment originating in the United States during the years of primitive manufacturing caused the deaths of 5,100 million people. The American Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research and its experimental bacterial meningococcal vaccine may have killed 5,100 million people in 1918. 19 is a far less effective sales slogan than the overly simplistic vaccines save lives. Kevin Barry, the disease which killed so many was not flu nor was it a virus. It was bacterial. During the mid-2000s there was much talk about pandemic preparedness. Influenza vaccine manufacturers in the United States received billions of taxpayer dollars to develop vaccines to make sure that we don't have another lethal pandemic flu, like the one in 1918-19. Capitalizing on the flu part of Spanish flu helped vaccine manufacturers procure billion-dollar checks from governments, even though scientists knew at the time that bacterial pneumonia was the real killer. It is not my opinion that bacterial pneumonia was the real killer. Thousands of autopsies confirm this fact. According to a 2008 National Institute of Health paper, bacterial pneumonia was the killer in a minimum of 92.7% of the 1,918 autopsies reviewed. It is likely higher than 92.7%. The researchers looked at more than 9,000 autopsies, and there were no negative, bacterial, lung culture results. In the 68 higher quality autopsy series, in which the possibility of unreported negative cultures could be excluded, 92.7% of autopsy lung cultures were positive for one bacterium. In one study of approximately 9,000 subjects who were followed from clinical presentation with influenza to resolution or autopsy, researchers obtained, with sterile technique, cultures of either pneumococci or streptococci from 164 of 167 lung tissue samples. There were 89 pure cultures of pneumococci, 19 cultures from which only streptococci were recovered, 34 that yielded mixtures of pneumococci and or streptococci, 22 that yielded a mixture of pneumococci, streptococci, and other organisms, prominently pneumococci and non-hemolytic streptococci, and 3 that yielded non-hemolytic streptococci alone. There were no negative lung culture results. 3. Pneumococci or streptococci were found in 164 of the 167 lung tissue samples autopsied, that is 98.2%. Bacteria was the killer. Where did the Spanish flu bacterial pneumonia of 1918-19 originate? When the United States declared war in April 1917, the fledgling pharmaceutical industry had something they had never had before, a large supply of human test subjects in the form of the U.S. military's first draft. Pre-war in 1917, the U.S. Army was 286,000 men. Post-war in 1920, the U.S. Army disbanded, and had 296,000 men. During the war years 1918-19, the U.S. Army ballooned to 6 million men, with 2 million men being sent overseas. The Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research took advantage of this new pool of human guinea pigs to conduct vaccine experiments. A report on anti-meningitis vaccination and observations on agglutinins in the blood of chronic meningococcus carriers as recorded by Frederick L. Gates, MD in 1918, from the base hospital, Fort Riley, Kansas and the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, New York, received July 20, 1918. Author note: please read the Fort Riley paper in its entirety so you can appreciate the carelessness of the experiments conducted on these troops. Between January 21 and June 4 of 1918, Dr. Gates reports on an experiment where soldiers were given 3 doses of a bacterial meningitis vaccine. Those conducting the experiment on the soldiers were just spitballing dosages of a vaccine serum made in horses. The vaccination regime was designed to be 3 doses. 4,792 men received the first dose, but only 4,257 got the second dose, down 11%, and only 3,702 received all 3 doses, down 22.7%. A total of 1,090 men were not there for the third dose. What happened to these soldiers? Were they shipped east by train from Kansas to board a ship to Europe? Were they in the Fort Riley Hospital? Dr. Gates' report doesn't tell us. An article accompanying the American Experience broadcast I watched sheds some light on where these one Gates began his experiments in January 1918. By March of that year, 100 men a day were entering the infirmary at Fort Riley. Are some of these the men missing from Dr. Gates' report, the ones who did not get the second or third dose? Shortly before breakfast on Monday, March 11, the first domino would fall, signaling the commencement of the first wave of the 1918 influenza. Company cook Albert Gitchell reported to the camp infirmary with complaints of a bad cold. Right behind him came Corporal Lee W. Drake voicing similar complaints. By noon, Camp Surgeon Edward R. Schreiner had over 100 sick men on his hands, all apparently suffering from the same malady. 5. Gates does report that several of the men in the experiment had flu-like symptoms, coughs, vomiting and diarrhea after receiving the vaccine. These symptoms are a disaster for men living in barracks, traveling on trains to the Atlantic coast, sailing to Europe, and living and fighting in trenches. Rev content and article solo. The unsanitary conditions at each step of the journey are an ideal environment for a contagious disease like bacterial pneumonia to spread. From Dr. Gates' report, several cases of looseness of the bowels or transient diarrhea were noted. This symptom had not been encountered before. Careful inquiry in individual cases often elicited the information that men who complained of the effects of vaccination were suffering from mild coryza, bronchitis, etc., at the time of injection. Sometimes the reaction was initiated by a chill or chilly sensation, and a number of men complained of fever or feverish sensations during the following night. Next in frequency came nausea, occasionally vomiting, dizziness, and general aches and pains in the joints and muscles, which in a few instances were especially localized in the neck or lumbar region, causing stiff neck or stiff back. A few injections were followed by diarrhea. The reactions, therefore, occasionally simulated the onset of epidemic meningitis, and several vaccinated men were sent as suspects to the base hospital for diagnosis. 4. According to Gates, they injected random dosages of an experimental bacterial meningitis vaccine into soldiers. Afterwards, some of the soldiers had symptoms which simulated meningitis, but Dr. Gates advances the fantastical claim that it wasn't actual meningitis. The soldiers developed flu-like symptoms. Bacterial meningitis, then and now, is known to mimic flu-like symptoms. 6. Perhaps a similarity of early symptoms of bacterial meningitis and bacterial pneumonia to symptoms of flu is why the vaccine experiments at Fort Riley have been able to escape scrutiny as a potential cause of the Spanish flu for 100 years and counting. How did the Spanish flu spread so widely and so quickly? There is an element of a perfect storm in how the Gates bacteria spread. WWI ended only 10 months after the first injections. Unfortunately for the 5,100 million who died, those soldiers injected with horse-infused bacteria moved quickly during those 10 months. An article from 2008 on the Seed to Seize website describes how sick WWI soldiers could pass along the bacteria to others by becoming cloud adults. Finally, for brief periods and to varying degrees, affected hosts became cloud adults who increased the aerosolization of colonizing strains of bacteria, particularly pneumococci, hemolytic streptococci, H. influenzae, and S. aureus, for several days during local epidemics, particularly in crowded settings such as hospital wards, military camps, troop ships, and mines, and trenches. Some persons were immunologically susceptible to, infected with, or recovering from infections with influenza virus. Persons with active infections were aerosolizing the bacteria that colonized their noses and throats, while others, often, in the same breathing spaces, were profoundly susceptible to invasion of and rapid spread through their lungs by their own or others' colonizing bacteria. 1. 3 times in his report on the Fort Riley vaccine experiment, Dr. Gates states that some soldiers had a severe reaction indicating an unusual individual susceptibility to the vaccine. While the vaccine made many sick, it only killed those who were susceptible to it. Those who became sick and survived became cloud adults who spread the bacteria to others, which created more cloud adults, spreading to others where it killed the susceptible, repeating the cycle until there were no longer wartime unsanitary conditions, and there were no longer millions of soldiers to experiment on. The toll on U.S. troops was enormous, and it is well documented. Dr. Carol Byerly describes how the influenza traveled like wildfire through the U.S. military. Substitute bacteria for Dr. Byerly's influenza or virus. 14 of the largest training camps had reported influenza outbreaks in March, April, or May, and some of the infected troops carried the virus with them aboard ships to France. As soldiers in the trenches became sick, the military evacuated them from the front lines and replaced them with healthy men. This process continuously brought the virus into contact with new hosts, young, healthy soldiers, in which it could adapt, reproduce, and become extremely virulent without danger of burning out. Before any travel ban could be imposed, a contingent of replacement troops departed Camp Devens, outside of Boston, for Camp Upton, Long Island, the Army's debarkation point for France, and took influenza with them. Medical officers at Upton said it arrived abruptly on September 13, 1918, with 38 hospital admissions, followed by 86 the next day, and 193 the next. Hospital admissions peaked on October 4 with 483, and within 40 days, Camp Upton sent 6,131 men to the hospital for influenza. Some developed pneumonia so quickly that physicians diagnosed it simply by observing the patient rather than listening to the lungs. 7. The United States was not the only country in possession of the Rockefeller Institute's experimental bacterial vaccine. A 1919 report from the Institute states, reference should be made that before the United States entered the war, in April 1917, the Institute had resumed the preparation of anti-meningococcic serum, in order to meet the requests of England, France, Belgium, Italy and other countries. The same report states, in order to meet the suddenly increased demand for the curative serums worked out at the Institute, a special stable for horses was quickly erected. 8. An experimental anti-meningoxic serum made in horses and injected into soldiers who would be entering the cramped and unsanitary living conditions of war. What could possibly go wrong? Is the bacterial serum made in horses at the Rockefeller Institute, which was injected into U.S. soldiers and distributed to numerous other countries, responsible for the 100 million people killed by bacterial lung infections in 1918-19? The institute says it distributed the bacterial serum to England, France, Belgium, Italy and other countries during WWI. Not enough is known about how these countries experimented on their soldiers. I hope independent researchers will take an honest look at these questions. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. I do not believe that anyone involved in these vaccine experiments was trying to harm anyone. Some will see the name Rockefeller and yell, "Illuminati!" or culling the herd. I do not believe that's what happened. I believe standard medical hubris is responsible, doctors playing God, thinking they can tame nature without creating unanticipated problems. With medical hubris, I do not think the situation has changed materially over the past 100 years. What now? The vaccine industry is always looking for human test subjects. They have the most success when they are able to find populations who are not in a position to refuse: soldiers, 9, infants, the disabled, prisoners, those in developing nations, anyone not in a position to refuse. Vaccine experimentation on vulnerable populations is not an issue of the past. Watch this video clip of Dr. Stanley Plotkin where he describes using experimental vaccines on orphans, the mentally retarded, prisoners, and those under colonial rule. The deposition was in January 2018. The hubris of the medical community is the same or worse now than it was 100 years ago. Watch as Dr. Plotkin admits to writing, "The question is whether we are to have experiments performed on fully functioning adults and on children who are potentially contributors to society, or to perform initial studies in children and adults who are human in form but not in social potential." Please watch the horrifying video clip of Dr. Stanley Plotkin testifying under oath about the experiments that the pharmaceutical industry has done on unaware, uninformed patients. https://.b/yev_slu7dw 10. In part because the global community is well aware of medical hubris and well aware of the poor record of medical ethics, the Universal Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights developed international standards regarding the right to informed consent to preventative medical procedures like vaccination. The international community is well aware that the pharmaceutical industry makes mistakes and is always on the lookout for human test subjects. The declaration states that individuals have the human right to consent to any preventative medical intervention like vaccination. Article 3, Human Dignity and Human Rights. 1. Human dignity, human rights and fundamental freedoms are to be fully respected. 2. The interests and welfare of the individual should have priority over the sole interest of science or society. Article 6, Consent. 1. Any preventive, diagnostic and therapeutic medical intervention is only to be carried out with the prior, free and informed consent of the person concerned, based on adequate information. The consent should, where appropriate, be express and may be withdrawn by the person concerned at any time and for any reason without disadvantage or prejudice. 11. Clean water, sanitation, flushing toilets, refrigerated foods and healthy diets have done and still do far more to protect humanity from infectious diseases than any vaccine program. Doctor and the vaccine industry have usurped credit which rightfully belongs to plumbers, electricians, sandhogs, engineers and city planners. For these reasons, policymakers at all levels of government should protect the human rights and individual liberties of individuals to opt out of vaccine programs via exemptions. The hubris of the medical community will never go away. Policymakers need to know that vaccines, like all medical interventions, are not infallible. Vaccines are not magic. We all have different susceptibility to disease. Human beings are not one size fits all. In 1918-19, the vaccine industry experimented on soldiers, likely with disastrous results. In 2018, the vaccine industry experiments on infants every day. The vaccine schedule has never been tested as it is given. The results of the experiment are in 1 in 7 of America's fully vaccinated children is in some form of special education and over 50% have some form of chronic illness. 12. In 1918-19, there was no safety follow-up after vaccines were delivered. In 2018, there is virtually no safety follow-up after a vaccine is delivered. Who exactly gave you that flu shot at Rite Aid? Do you have their cell number of the store employee if something goes wrong? In 1918-19, there was no liability to the manufacturer for injuries or death caused by vaccines. In 2018, there is no liability for vaccine manufacturers for injuries or death caused by vaccines, which was formalized in 1986. 13. In 1918-19, there was no independent investigative follow-up challenging the official story that Spanish flu was some mystery illness which dropped from the sky. I suspect that many of those at the Rockefeller Institute knew what happened, and that many of the doctors who administered the vaccines to the troops knew what happened, but those people are long dead. In 2018, the pharmaceutical industry is the largest campaign donor to politicians and the largest advertiser in all forms of media, so not much has changed over 100 years. This story will likely be ignored by mainstream media because their salaries are paid by pharmaceutical advertising. The next time you hear someone say vaccines save lives, please remember that the true story of the cost-benefit of vaccines is much more complicated than their three-word slogan. Also remember that vaccines may have killed 100 million people in 1918-19. If true, those costs greatly outweighed any benefit, especially considering that plumbers, electricians, sandhogs and engineers did, and continue to do, the real work which reduces mortality from disease. Vaccines are not magic. Human rights and bioethics are critically important. Policymakers should understand the history of medical hubris and protect individual and parental human rights as described in the Universal Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights. Kevin Barry is the president of First Freedoms, Incorporated, a 501(c)(3). He is a former federal attorney, a rep at the UNHQ in New York and the author of Vaccine Whistleblower, Exposing Autism Research Fraud at the CDC. Please support our work at www.firstfreedoms.org, originally published at firstfreedoms.org. Reprinted with permission. References 1. Death. About the author. Dr. Gary G. Coles is a medical doctor working for most of his career as a rural, full-service family practice physician. In 1984 he was awarded a Bush Foundation Medical Fellowship. In the early 1990s Dr. Coles worked at a regional treatment center as a physician for psychiatric inpatients and later worked at a psychological services clinic. Now retired, he continues to present lectures and seminars to healthcare professionals and the general public, as well as editing the popular e-newsletter Preventive Psychiatry e-newsletter, PEN. Josef Mengele, Josef, About the Sound. Listen, March 16, 1911, February 7, 1979, also known as the Angel of Death, German, Todesengel, was a German Schutzstaffel, SS, officer and physician during World War II. He is mainly remembered for his actions at the Auschwitz concentration camp, where he performed deadly experiments on prisoners, and was a member of the team of doctors who selected victims to be killed in the gas chambers and was one of the doctors who administered the gas. With Red Army troops sweeping through Poland, Mengele was transferred 280 kilometers, 170 miles, from Auschwitz to the Gross-Rosen concentration camp on January 17, 1945, just 10 days before the arrival of the Soviet forces at Auschwitz. Wiki/Josef_Mengele.
Josef Rudolf Mengele.
The Horrifying American Roots of Nazi Eugenics. Visit my YouTube channels, Try Something. Vegetarian, Perfect Society and The Future channel on YouTube. Historiansnetwork.org. Edwin Black's Nazi Nexus, America's Corporate Connections to Hitler's Holocaust exposes and documents how, just like their German counterparts, American corporations like Ford, GM, IBM, Coca-Cola, the Carnegie Institution, and the Rockefeller Foundation surreptitiously aided and abetted the Nazis in order to gain illicit profits. /reader-supported-news.org.
So, I think that's about it. People can research this further themselves, of course, and come to their own conclusions. And there are many people that want to keep vaccination voluntary for several reasons. And I've covered electroporation, electropermeabilization, and the gene drive extinction technology that scientists want a moratorium on, like on 5G in previous broadcasts. So check my channel Perfect Society on YouTube, and I might be able to do another important broadcast. So share this on your timeline for a better future. Remember to boycott companies that have a destructive effect, that have a negative influence on your future. And well, in many countries people can still protest, and they can make petitions, cyber activism. I think we need to expose what needs to be exposed, and that may be one of the best methods to prevent this population reduction. So thank you all for watching. More about the weather on my channel as well. Also about geoengineering. I made the top 10 of mainstream media blackout subjects. Things the mainstream media should report about but didn't. I take some more water. So many people think this is a generated heat wave basically. And people can use some plant sprayer. And to get some sunshine is a good idea anyway. Sunlight breaks down cyanide, gets rid of winter depression, vitamin D production, that's vitamin D production, and also the UV light destroys viruses. So people can study the involvement of the Rockefeller Foundation in the tracking plan and in population reduction plans for everyone. And I think it's the government's job to arrest people that have incited to commit genocide, want to reduce the global population, perhaps also the secret societies that Kennedy warned us about, and that it's illegal incitement to commit genocide. There are many book quotes, and of course the $1 million Georgia Guidestones that prove beyond any reasonable doubt that there is a conspiracy to reduce the global population. So check it out, it affects almost everybody. And Jesuits, Freemasons, Bilderbergers, Bill Gates, Rutte and Kissinger for example, the Committee of 300, Subversive Body of the Club of Rome, George Soros, and the population reduction NGOs are a few groups involved in this illegal population reduction. Harvard also, I think, something green in the website URL, name, title. so people can research this for themselves, and we can all think what we can do about this stuff. To survive, your life is the most important thing. Second is real love. Third is the real law. So check more important broadcasts in perfect society. Please share, please like and subscribe, and sign the petition on gopetition.com. Keep vaccination voluntary, specifically gene drive extinction technology and electroporation vaccines, new technologies. So then they could argue that's an excuse when it goes wrong, because they've never tested the long-term effects of these relatively new technologies. And I've covered why scientists want a moratorium on the gene drive technology. So, and some people think that quantum dot tattoo is the mark of the beast, and the Bible and other books may have been written by a time-traveling neural network, synthetic telepathy machine that controls the human mind. I've covered, for example, the Kobe Bryant helicopter crash predictions in a broadcast, and also more about the time-traveling neural network in the scalar patterns broadcast. So my other channels, I try something about vegetarian and the future channel on YouTube, also the top 10 of population reduction methods and countermeasures people can take. So yeah, thank you all for watching. See if anybody wrote anything in the chat. Hey man, Chris Hayes writes, well, then I'm gonna report, no, I add moderator, so now you're now a moderator. Please don't moderate anyone, so don't take comments away. It's only for links, posting information. So yeah, I haven't been broadcasting for a week, so many people might have forgotten about me. So let them know that I'm back and ready to save the world and the maximum number of human lives, and to create that perfect society in which we all will live happily eternally. Possible because everything is energy, and time travel is possible. Scalar technology, in combination with the neural networks, nanotechnology, robots, and the fact that everything is energy. A matter transformer could be created. We can transform air molecules into anything else, bread or gold, depending on what we need. So the streets of gold that Prince Rogers Nelson was singing about might one day be created. Thank you all for watching. Love and patience. And perhaps also Reichian therapy, punching a pillow and stuff. There are more healing things people can do. An air ionizer, for example. And of course the antiviral tea tree oils, of which it's scientifically proven that they're antiviral. That's definitely a good idea. Thank you all for watching. Kiss for single ladies who would like one. And I'm now in Maarsen in the Netherlands, and people can always Skype Prologic 999 if they want to ask me anything, or do a live or a semi-live broadcast. I record it first to be sure that it's not in violation of the YouTube user policy, and so we can make broadcasts and people can join one of my 4 movements. More about it in my previous broadcasts, for example the anti-global government movement, which is not so much that we're not against a global government chosen by and for the people. That's clear. We are against population reduction to 500 million, 93% chance that we die ourselves if they presented with that, and also a dictatorial government, even compact cities, and I might cover this in my next broadcast. It's about homes being demolished in Great Britain. So check it out. I might do that in, I don't know, perhaps today, perhaps tomorrow. Depends on how busy I am to get my life up and running again. Okay, see you next time on Perfect Society. Peace out.